Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. It is the 19th day of June in the year 2017, and it is a pleasure to be with you. I give you that date so that you'll realize that we are indeed live today. Last week, for some unforeseen reasons, technical reasons mainly, we were unable to be on the air, and we had some severe weather do some damage to some equipment. But I think we're okay now. We've got some weather in play as we broadcast, but we haven't lost power yet. So, and I'm assuming the worst of the storm is probably over. About an hour and a half ago, I was a little bit leery. We had some banging thunder and a little bit of lightning and a lot of rain. But right now it's just the rain. So I do hope that everybody is well. And again, let me thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Head On Radio Network. I do encourage you to continue to do all you can to help out Bob and Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks who really go to great lengths to keep this network on the air and keep programs like this available. So again, thank you for all you continue to do, and thank you for your continued support. We would love to hear from you. I've got a number of issues today. Obviously, our programming has been a bit spotty of late, so and I've got a number of issues that I wanted to deal with you. I've been putting quite a bit on Facebook in recent days, but in fact, Facebook is one of the things I want to talk a little bit about today. But first, I would like to do the traditional housekeeping, which is to share with you our phone number and encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to share your thoughts and your ideas, concerns, whatever they might be, with our listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you call that number, Bob Kincaid is in the studio, and he will take your call, and in a moment he'll have you on the air. So again, it's 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit reluctant to go on the air, but at the same time you'd like to share your thoughts and your ideas and get potentially some feedback to them, then you can do that by sending me an email. If you send me an email, I'd be glad to get your ideas, your thoughts on the air for you. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. That's WAObrien, OBRIEN 906, lowercase, all one word, no punctuation, @gmail.com. And again, I mentioned our Facebook page. I continue to post links to particular readings that I come across that I believe you would do well to take a look at. So far, I've been meticulous in not posting anything, first, that I haven't read, but more important, that I haven't made some sort of comment about in order to let you know why I think that this particular link is something you might want to check out. Over the months and years that we've been doing this program, I've developed, I think, a fairly good sense as to the kinds of issues and the kinds of things that would most interest our listeners, our regular listeners. And those are the articles on those topics. These are the ones that I try to share with you after I read it. If it does indeed seem to be something that says some things that all of us ought to be familiar with, then I will do the best I can on Facebook to not only post the link, but also a paragraph or two about the particular issue and the particular article that I'm linking you to. So again, if you go to Facebook, to the homepage, in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page, and the most recent postings will come first, and then they gradually become older and older. It seems, from my own experience, I tend to do a lot of posting on Facebook over the weekend when we're not doing the programs. In looking at materials that I think we'll be covering today, I kind of made a decision earlier today that I was going to make an effort this evening, if possible, in the morning, if I have to post something in relation to what we're talking about today. There are 2 or 3 issues that have been kind of buzzing around in my little brain for a number of days. And I wanted to get into those today, if I could. One of them is the issue of impeachment. The word is now being talked about, bandied about, if you will, in a number of different circles. It was the word, the infamous I word, as it's called by some. Nobody would mention it earlier, but now it is being mentioned. And most of the attention, most of this has occurred since former FBI Director James Comey's testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee a couple of weeks ago. And with that testimony and with his firing, the discussions about impeachment have become more and more rampant, more and more flagrant. And there are different points of view on this. Some argue that while there's an awful lot of behavior that is questionable, very questionable, it may not reach the level of a conviction in impeachment. On the other hand, there are a number of people, many of them constitutional experts, who take issue with that. And so I've been playing around with the idea. Let me kind of share with you where I'm going here. Most of the attention so far has been in the area of what is called obstruction of justice. Most people conclude that the firing of FBI Director Comey constituted the last straw, as it were, in a series of events that basically could constitute obstruction of justice. And that seems to be the focus of most of the conversation about impeachment, is the issue of obstruction. I really believe, along with this, we hear more and more discussion about Watergate. In fact, we've just celebrated, if you can call it that, the anniversary, the 45th, I think, anniversary of the Watergate break-in in 1970. Well, the Nixon's resignation was in 1974. The break-in was in 1972. So I believe it's 45 years. And the other evening, and of course many of you will recall the movie All the President's Men that came out on Watergate some years after that. Well, MSNBC ran a 2-hour special Saturday evening entitled All the President's Men Revisited, and many of the people that were in the original movie were interviewed, and much of the issues surrounding the whole Watergate investigation and to the resignation of the president were revisited, and it was very, very well done. And after all of this time, you obviously, most of us forget a lot of the details. So I found it quite informative as well. But the point that I would make, and the point I want to make, is that more and more we're hearing contrasts and comparisons made between Watergate and the situation that is currently going on right now with the so-called Russian thing, which is what President Trump refers to it. And he continues to insist that it's fake news and all the rest of it. But increasingly, the comparisons between Watergate 45 years ago and the situation now are being made. And I see the obstruction of justice focus as part of that comparison. I started to write something a few days ago, and I kind of abandoned it because I don't think it was. I hadn't stopped tossing it around in my mind, and I guess I really wasn't ready to write down conclusions because I hadn't reached any. But one of the things that seemed to me to be a reality is that there's an inclination on the part of a lot of people to force fit today's events into the Watergate model, or the Watergate situation of 45 years ago. And I think obstruction of justice, that very charge itself, is one of those. In fact, you get a number of people also talking about abuses of power. And it seems to me that obstruction of justice seems to be much more focused on a criminal activity, on illegality, on a violation of the law. Abuse of justice or abuse of power, it seems to me, is a little bit more vague. It's a little bit less definitive. On the other hand, I think it bears a little bit more substance to the events that are occurring today. In the most recent edition of the New York Review of Books, which is online, which was put online on June 8th, so we're getting ready for the next edition of the New York Review. But there is an article in the June 8th edition by Ellen Drew on the Trump presidency. The article, she wrote the article late in May. On the date that she posts there is May 25th. That's when she submitted the article. It appeared in the New York Review of Books on June 8th, when the current edition of the publication became available. And the title of her article is Trump, the Presidency in Peril. It is an excellent survey of the events up until the 1st of June. So it doesn't include the Comey firing. But there's a tremendous account of the Russian connection, the reputed or alleged meetings, if you will, between Michael Flynn and many of the other members of the administration, Jared Kushner and all the rest of it. It is an excellent survey, a compilation of information. One issue that she raises in this article caught my eye more than the rest of the article. It seemed to stand out. And let me share with you exactly what that is. She points out that if you read the contract, the terms of appointment of the special counsel, Robert Mueller, his charge is to investigate criminal activity on the part of the White House, on the part of the president. You'll recall at the time of Comey's testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that on 3 different occasions, James Comey had reassured the president that he was not the object of an FBI investigation. Consequently, after Comey's testimony, despite all the negatives about the president's behavior that followed the testimony of James Comey, the administration continued to insist that Comey himself, in his testimony, had alleviated any threat of criminal activity on the part of the president. That by reassuring the president on 3 different occasions that he wasn't the object of an FBI investigations, that in effect exonerated the president, the administration argues, of criminal activity. And the administration has continued to insist on that. Ellen Drew's article points out that Robert Mueller's appointment is focused principally on the search or the investigation for criminal activity. Her point, however, is that impeachable offenses don't necessarily equate with criminal activity. Obstruction of justice as the objective, as the key charge that most people focus on, would seem to suggest something criminal. But the fact of the matter is, as Ellen Drew points out, impeachable activities obviously include criminal activities, but they can also include other things that are not out-and-out violations of the law. Let me share with you a couple of the points that Ellen Drew makes in this particular article. She says in one of the paragraphs, when it was considering the impeachment of Richard Nixon, the House Judiciary Committee, this is in the early 70s, of course, concluded that high crimes meant something broader than offenses listed in the criminal code. The concept of impeachment was largely lifted by the founders from English law, which Edmund Burke explained to Parliament meant, quote, that statesmen who abuse their power will be accused and tried by fellow statesmen, quote, not upon the niceties of a narrow jurisprudence, but upon the enlarged and solid principles of state morality, unquote. Basically, what this paragraph suggests is that impeachment and criminality don't necessarily have to go together. The president's insistence that James Comey's testimony exonerated him of all criminal activity, even if that's true, does not necessarily, in and of itself, eliminate the possibility of impeachment. Edmund Burke's quotation from English law states the whole idea of abuse of power and the way to address the issue of abuse of power is to have statesmen tried by fellow statesmen, not upon the niceties of narrow jurisprudence, but upon the enlarged and solid principles of state morality. Impeachable offenses, Ellen Drew says, are political questions, not necessarily legal ones. Alexander Hamilton made specific references in the Federalist Papers to the issue of impeachable offenses by suggesting that they were political, quote, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself, unquote. There were 3 articles of impeachment adopted by the House Judiciary Committee against Richard Nixon in 1974. Ellen Drew points out that the most important of the 3 articles of impeachment was for abuse of power. And this is a quote. The critical holding by the committee was that a president can be held accountable for the acts of subordinates as well as for actions that aren't, strictly speaking, crimes. In the end, an impeachment of a president is grounded in the theory that the holder of that office has failed to fulfill his responsibility set out in Article 2 of the Constitution to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, unquote. The point is that there is a substantial gap between offenses that are potentially impeachable and offenses that are illegal. Obviously, the administration is trying to focus on the issue of criminal activity, of legality, and suggesting thereby that if there's nothing illegal, then the president is completely exonerated. This particular article provides substantive evidence, it seems to me, to indicate that that's not necessarily true. Ellen Drew points out, for example, that not only can the president be impeached for his own activity, his own behavior, but also bears responsibility for the behavior and activities of those that he appoints. She makes the point, for example, that among the crimes that the Watergate defendants were convicted of and that might be applicable to the situation going on today are bribery, threat of perjury, criminal obstruction of justice, money laundering, tax evasion, witness tampering, violations of election laws, including campaign finance laws. As far as the Russian situation is concerned, in today's situation, there's a possibility that foreign agent registration laws have been broken, as well as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that would involve, examples or evidences of perjury. This idea, this flexibility in defining high crimes and misdemeanors basically means that the president is accountable not only for what he does, but for creating situations which cause other people to do things which constitute a violation of his oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and take care that the laws be faithfully executed. For example, this concept, I'm quoting directly from Ellen Drew here, this concept of accountability is critical to preventing a president from setting a tone in the White House or dropping hints that can't be traced, that lead to a pattern of acts by his aides that amount to, as in the case of Watergate, a violation of constitutional government. In the case of the Russian affair, even if the president's fingerprints are not found on any single act, misdeeds committed by Trump's aides and close associates could amount to an impeachable offense on the part of the president. By definition, impeachable offenses would appear to concern conduct only during the presidency itself. But a number of constitutional scholars, one of them being Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, are questioning if the president or his associates acted secretly and corruptly to rig the election itself, then that period before the inauguration would also constitute an impeachable offense. The issue here, the reason I raise this is because the issue here is one of narrow versus broad interpretation of the Constitution. If you take the language of the Constitution, high crimes and misdemeanors, by definition, those terms are broad. High crimes, how high? Offenses, what kind of offenses? And so the implication is that there's a lot of latitude, a lot of flexibility that the founders wrote into this particular aspect of the Constitution that related to impeachment of a president. It makes perfect sense that the president and his administration would try to look at this in a very narrow sense by focusing on the issue of illegality. But legal scholars, more and more, are telling us that you really have to look at this question from a much broader perspective than that. If you're going to get into the area of abuse of power, you're talking about patterns of behavior. You're talking about perspective, about tone, about issues related to other issues. Let me share with you, this is an article that was in the New York Times some days ago, where a number of legal scholars weighed in on the issue of impeachable offenses. This particular quotation I'm going to read you is from Jed Sugarman, who teaches law at Fordham University. He's a legal historian and a professor in the law school. And he was asked for his reaction to James Comey's testimony. And his response is the following: all of that together is very clear proof of President Trump's intent. You have to look at the entirety of the testimony, the timelines, and especially that it ended with the firing of Comey. It's not clear that all the events just in the written testimony constitutes obstruction. The case for obstruction turns on the end result, the firing. When you take that all together, focused on a background to the firing, that's the basis of the obstruction case. So in other words, what Sugarman is encouraging us to do is look at these things from a broader perspective than the participants are inclined to focus on. That by definition, the administration would obviously try to focus on much more specifics. Christina Rodriguez, who teaches constitutional law at Yale, kind of agrees with Sugarman. She said, I definitely think it's abuse of power. I don't know whether it's an obstruction of justice, she said. This episode is the latest example of his assault on the norms that keep presidential power in check. Whether it's impeachable is whether you would call it a high crime or misdemeanor, unquote. Again, she's inclined to look at the issue of abuse of power rather than obstruction. Obstruction seems almost to demand violations of the law. But abuse of power is much broader and more vague than that. And as Ellen Drew pointed out, going all the way back to English law, the whole idea of impeachment is basically for violations against the morality of the, morality and against one's commitment to serve the state. Rodriguez goes on and said, if you couple it with other aspects of the president's behavior since he took office, you can begin to build a case for impeachment, she said. I don't think the Republicans would impeach him, but it doesn't mean that Democrats couldn't heighten congressional scrutiny on the president and push the Republicans into a situation where they're forced to start asking questions, unquote. Michael Gerhardt, University of North Carolina Law School, talked about President Trump's actions related to James Comey as unusual and inappropriate. Quote, it is unusual for a president to be talking that way, and I think it's hard to say whether that rises to a level of obstruction of justice. But it is unusual and it is inappropriate. It has certainly been the norm for presidents not to be inquiring about and expressing opinions about ongoing investigations. The president is usually arm's length from, some distance from that, not to be opining about ongoing investigations and bringing it up not once or twice, but a few times. I think most people would find it unusual and inappropriate. If this were President Hillary Clinton inquiring about an investigation of someone she knew, I would expect Republicans would be outraged, unquote. Louis Michael Seidman, Georgetown University Law Center law professor, on the issue of President Trump and James Comey. If what Comey testified to is accurate, it is very serious, Seidman said. So it appears that the president gave what amounts to an order to stop an investigation, and when Comey didn't follow the order, he was fired. That is not far removed from the kind of things that got Richard Nixon into trouble. You'll think back, I think, or recall, that in Comey's testimony, when he was telling the committee what the president had said to him, he included the words, "I hope," about allegedly exerting pressure over Comey. I hope you will let this go. I hope you can, absolve Michael Flynn. He's a good guy. And the president's focus is on the words, "I hope." The argument being that the mere fact that he said, "I hope," denies the reality of a threat. In other words, it denies violation of the law. And that's the point. Sugarman at Fordham says the Republican pushback is a strategy of isolating individual moments. But you have to put all of that in with the firing, in context and in tone. It felt like a directive from his boss, Sugarman said. So in other words, it's the tone, it's the total package, it's the total exchange, not the inclusion of the words "I hope" in and of themselves. I think, and I have thought for some days now, that this is important, because I think there's an inclination to confuse the general with the specific. I think there's an inclination to assume that impeachment only applies to illegal behavior. I think it's evident from these particular constitutional scholars that the very wording of the impeachment clause in the Constitution itself is vague, is not definitive. The implication being that impeachable activities, impeachable behavior, can be a case that can be put together whether in fact there's an actual violation of the law or not. And I think this is a very, very important issue. I think it's one that all of us need to be aware of and follow closely, because this obviously is not over. And it's not likely to be over anytime soon. We're beginning to get information now that the investigation of the special counsel Mueller could go on for months, maybe even a year, before all the evidence is collected and looked upon. So there's a lot is going to be going on, and a lot is going to continue to happen. And I think it's very, very important that we kind of refine our positions, our perspectives. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I do believe that this is incredibly important. I think also it's important to keep in mind Ellen Drew's reminder that Robert Mueller's appointment focuses principally on criminal activities, possible criminal activities. And so it's going to be interesting to see how all of this shakes out, I think. Obviously, here on this program, in an institution or a structure called the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, then the meaning of the language in the impeachment portion of Article 2 of the Constitution seems to be critically important and quite relevant to what the Virtual Center is, or what this program is all about. I would love to get your reaction to this. You might want to look at it. You might want to go back, if you really want a fairly concise summary of some of the events through the campaign and into the first three or 4 months of the Trump presidency, go online to the New York Review of Books and look at the article by Ellen Drew. I think you'll find it very helpful. It's a pretty good listing of all the activities and all questionable behaviors and that kind of thing. It's well done. It's solid history, it seems to me. We're just about 3/4 of the way through our first hour. It's about 16 minutes before the hour. I'd like to get into the issue that obviously is pervading most of the discussions over this past weekend, and it's the shooting in Alexandria. More specifically, it's the level of vitriol and hate that seems to be rampant in a society that can cause somebody like the shooter to take action. I think one of the things we've seen in this particular situation is Democrats and Republicans in the House, principally, come together over this shooting. And I think many of us, and I count myself among these, kind of hope that an event like this might precipitate some toning down in the rhetoric. You may recall that President Trump's message to the nation after the shooting was incredibly positive. But as you know, it wasn't that long before the president immediately reverted back to the issue of fake news and the idea of a witch hunt against him and all the other things that we hear so much about. I made up my mind this weekend that I wanted to address this issue here in the virtual center. And let me tell you specifically what brought this to my attention, to my mind. Some of you may have seen the fact that there was a lot of pressure being put on NBC, on advertisers who were paying for advertising time on Megyn Kelly's new Sunday evening program, to withdraw their support from that program, to withdraw their advertising, because of one of the guests, one of the features that she was planning to do on last evening's program, an interview with Alex Jones, who's a talk show host, a extreme right-wing talk show host, and one of the things he basically argued was that the shooting in Connecticut of the elementary school children never really happened. It was set up. It was a myth. And a lot of people are so appalled by that they didn't want Megyn Kelly or NBC to give this character airtime. And it raised the whole question about censorship. And it raised the whole question about our ability to communicate. It obviously raises questions about the infamous, not infamous, that's not the right word, mythical, I would say, marketplace of ideas. The idea that in our society, the way that we have chosen since the Enlightenment to pursue truth is to encourage the free exchange of ideas on the assumption that the clash of competing points of view will lead inevitably to the truth. I have mentioned before, I think it's very helpful. If you look at our system of justice, our protections of citizen rights to trial by jury, to having a jury of their peers, to justice that happens rapidly, the traditional expression, justice delayed is justice denied. In other words, the assumption that those accused of a crime have the right to have their case heard in a reasonable time frame, and they have a right to a trial, to an attorney, and all the other protections. And you've heard, if you watch Law and Order, you've heard them read their rights to those they arrest and that kind of thing. So this particular situation raises some serious issues because it suggests how hostile competing ideologies have become in our political system. And it also raises the question about people on either side of the political spectrum contributing to this level of hate and vitriol, and thereby making it more and more difficult, if not impossible, to reach conclusions, to talk, to communicate, to sit down across the table from each other and bang out solutions to problems. It's much more than an us versus them situation. It's the belief on either side that the other side is un-American, or that the other side poses a threat to the safety and security of the nation. In other words, not only do I disagree with you, but I am so convinced that what you stand for is so wrong and so bad that I'm comfortable in denying you access to the marketplace. I don't even want you to have the opportunity to air your ideas. And that's the issue of censorship. Most of us, and the person I have in mind right now is Bernie Sanders, who appeared on one of the Sunday morning talk shows. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was Face the Nation on CBS. But he made the point about censorship that to him, censorship was always very clear and very easy to define. And the example he used were those people who want to ban Huckleberry Finn because of some of Mark Twain's language in related racial language, principally related to Jim, the African American, in Huckleberry Finn. And so his argument, Bernie Sanders' point, is efforts to try to take Jim out of Huckleberry Finn is really the way that he grew up defining censorship. But now it becomes much more complicated than that. And I'm going to use Bernie Sanders as a case in point. When he appeared on Face the Nation yesterday, Bernie Sanders made it very clear how appalled he is by what Republicans are doing, in Congress, especially with health care. And he made the point that the House bill, which passed some weeks ago, that would have taken away health care for 23 million plus Americans, is horrendous. The behavior of the 10-member committee of Republicans in the Republican-controlled United States Senate that is in on the development of the Senate's version of health care legislation to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. This is being done totally in secret. Mitch McConnell is manipulating the rules of the Senate in such a way that there's no debate, there's no possibility of amendments. This is going to come to the floor of the Senate for an up or down vote. And McConnell seems to believe he's got the 50 votes. The reason I'm saying all of this is because the shooter in Alexandria seemingly was a supporter of Bernie Sanders. And he belonged to groups and frequented websites that talk about getting rid of the Republicans, getting rid of Trump. And when he took weapons to the ball field late last week, last Friday night, I believe, last Friday morning, he basically acted on the ideological positions which he supported. Yesterday, Bernie Sanders, in his appearance on Face the Nation, talked about how nobody can condone violence. Nobody should support violence. Our form of government, our Constitution, is built around the idea of resolving our problems, debating issues. I kept thinking about this. And my decision to raise this issue on today's program is related directly to this. We're about 3 or 4 minutes before the top of the hour, and I think this is probably a good situation in a number of ways. It's going to give me an opportunity to say what I really want to say. And at the same time, we'll follow it with our break, which will give you an opportunity to think about what I've said. And then when we come back in our second hour, you have the opportunity to respond by picking up the phone or by sending me an email or however you would choose to respond. The issue that I'm dealing with is the faith, the belief that all of us have that violence is never acceptable in this society. The norms of our society is to air our differences in public, to debate them, and to resolve the differences between us. That's what Bernie Sanders said yesterday on Face the Nation. He said he's opposed to censorship. And like all of us, he's opposed to violence. Let me make a point. I am not advocating violence. In no way am I justifying violence. But I do believe that for a lot of people, violence is the only answer in situations where the behavior that precipitates it is so inhuman and so stupid that it has no place in civilized society. What I'm raising here is the issue of everybody's right to their opinion, whatever it might be, on the assumption that in this society, everybody has the right to their opinion, and more than that, everybody's opinion deserves serious consideration. I have to take issue with that. I heard one member of Congress this weekend make the point in one of the talk shows, make the point that health care as an issue ought not to be a matter of debate. Health care is something that everybody realizes is necessary. Nobody in today's world, in today's America, can make it without health care. If that's true, then how is one to deal with a legislative proposal to take health care away from 23 million people? Does there at times arise issues, or do there arise issues that run so contrary to common sense that they don't even deserve debate? What I'm suggesting here is the fact that all of us have an obligation to behave responsibly. What I see as the biggest danger to the separation and the hatred that seems to separate Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, all the rest of it in today's world, what I see the real problem being is that in not talking to each other, we have lost our sense, or we are losing our sense, that there are certain things that all of us agree on. There are certain norms. There's certain behavior that all of us grew up believing is acceptable and is expected. And we should expect people to behave and act in certain ways. And when you reach the point that we've reached in partisanship in this country, not only do we get into trouble with the things that separate us, but we lose touch with the things that ought not to, that don't separate us. And that's a mistake, I believe. That's the hidden danger in all of this. Because I believe we must revisit these common principles. Those things that human beings are entitled to because they are human beings, irrespective of all the superficial things that might divide us: class, education, race, nationality, religion. The fact of the matter is, all human beings are entitled to certain things as acceptable, as universally agreed upon as human rights. If that's true, then what can we expect except violence when people, for reasons that don't make that much sense to us take steps to violate the very norms and the very principles that constitute civilized society. I think we got a problem. I really do. And I think the problem is that our accepted traditional ways of resolving our differences have become largely inoperable because those differences have become so great. And I think we can see it in the healthcare legislation. The congressman who made the comment yesterday that healthcare ought not even to be a matter of debate because everybody can appreciate how important it is in today's society. Then we have to deal with the reality. If it's a given, why is one of our political parties taking steps to eliminate millions of people from it? Is there any agenda, any rationale for doing that that outweighs the availability of health care for human beings in today's society? I would suggest that if people who should know better are going to act stupidly, are going to do things that are not only stupid but inhuman, and have no place in a civilized society, then they are responsible for the violence that breaks out. Especially when you have so many people out there who are on the edge anyway, who feel that the American dream or anything remotely connected to it has passed them by or is not going to be operable in their lives. If people reach extreme depths of frustration and anger, then something like stupid behavior like this will precipitate violence. Martin Luther King, in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, reacted to southern states who claimed that the demonstrations that he was participating in for civil rights precipitated violence. And King's argument in that letter was, it's not us that are causing the violence. It's the laws of separation and discrimination that these same people passed that caused the violence. I think that's an issue that we're facing today. We can continue it after, but right now let's pause and take our break because it's about 6 minutes after the top of the hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Monday. Today is the 19th day of June in the year 2017, and if you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you were with us through the first hour, then you know that we covered, I don't know whether we thoroughly covered it, but we devoted quite a bit of attention through the bulk of the first hour on the issues of impeachment and the idea of criminal activity. And we looked at a couple of sources that made it very clear that impeachable offenses are not necessarily illegal acts, that there can be acts, patterns of behavior, which don't constitute violations of the law, which could indeed be found impeachable. And I think that's the issue that we focused on through the better part of our first hour. And then about 15 minutes before the top of the hour, we got into the issue of violence and free speech and censorship in our society. More specifically, we got into the shooting in Alexandria of Scalise and some of the other Republican Congress people who were on the ball field preparing for the Friday evening charity game against Democrats. And we were talking about that in light of our traditional constitutional approach towards solving our problems, which is to air them, get them on the table, trust in the marketplace of ideas, relying on principles such as free speech, free assembly, freedom of the press, as ways to air our legitimate differences and bring these to acceptable resolution. Not that one side or the other side is going to win everything, but ultimately there's going to be some sort of compromise reached. And the issue, it seems to me, is that we have reached the point of distrust and hatred in our society for the other side, as it were, that we cease communication totally, or almost totally. More than that, we not only are unable to resolve the things that separate us, we lose sight of the things in our world that don't separate us, the things we agree on. And that creates a real problem. The point that I was making, and I'll just reiterate it, and then I'll go through the housekeeping things with the phone number and such. My point is that in a civilized society, there are certain givens that all people need to agree on. And what that means is that these givens, these norms, these acceptable truths, if you were, are not open to discussion and debate. By definition, they are givens. They are key ingredients that help to define a civilized society. If people take positions which are contrary to these acceptable things, these beliefs, this issue of the rights of human beings as human beings, if people begin to advocate things which violate those basic principles, it seems to me there's responsibility and accountability for what kinds of behavior that action can precipitate. Yes, like all of us, I don't agree with violence. But on the other hand, in some cases, I can understand it. It's not that we condone it. It's the fact that we have to recognize that we're moving very, very close to a situation when more and more of this is liable to happen unless we begin to rethink what we're doing. And that's the particular point that I was trying to make just prior to our top of the hour break. Let me begin by sharing with you our phone number, because if you are interested in weighing in on this issue or other issues that we've touched upon or today or in the past, by all means feel free to do so. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me in an email, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And I do encourage you to take a look at our Facebook page. I do believe, I mentioned at the beginning of our first hour, that on one of the topics that we were talking about today, I was going to make an effort in the next day or two to get a posting on Facebook about this issue. And the issue that I had in mind is this issue of abuse of power versus obstruction of justice. More specifically, on the issues of general situations and general circumstances versus illegal behavior or illegal activity. I think it's very important that all of us keep in mind that impeachment is not limited to illegal acts alone, which raises the question about the appointment of Special Counsel Robert Mueller to investigate the Russian situation and the hacking of the last fall's elections. Yes, there is the potential that there's illegality, that there are illegal acts associated with some of the things that have been going on. But there's also a pattern of behavior that may not be illegal, but at the same time might constitute a situation which would reach the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, to use the language in Article 2 of the Constitution in association with impeachment. So again, I will be doing something on our Facebook page on that. I do invite you to take a look at our Facebook page. There are a number of postings on there of the last several days. One of the things that I came across just before we came on the air today was a posting I put on there some days ago. It related to an article about President Trump's base, his hardcore supporters. And basically it suggested that that many people have wondered, I know I have, do the people who voted for Donald Trump and support him seemingly no matter what, do they believe some of the things that he's saying and that are happening, or that he wants to happen? Do they really believe this about immigration, about immigrants and refugees and terrorism and all the rest of it, and the potential deportation of millions of illegal aliens in this country? Do they really believe these things? This particular article addressed that question and raised the possibility that it's entirely likely that many Trump supporters don't believe it at all. But at the same time, they take delight in watching their opponents squirm, in watching liberals squirm, and watching Democrats squirm. And so oftentimes they'll pretend that they believe it just to initiate the anticipated reaction. I thought it was an interesting perspective, and I put that posting on Facebook. So you might want to take a look at it. It's one of the more recent postings that I put on there. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, just go to the search box at the top, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and there you'll be into our Facebook page. I wanted to continue for a little bit further this issue of violence and responsibility for it. And what I'm basically suggesting here is it's not black and white. It's not cut and dried. It's much more complicated than any of us would wish it is. Because there's a tendency for people who hear this to believe that I'm condoning violence. On the contrary, I am not. But what I am doing is acknowledging the realities that in certain circumstances, in certain situations, one can expect violence because those people who would perpetrate it don't believe they have any other avenue. That's the danger of the partisanship that we're dealing with. That's what Madison was worried about when he talked about controlling the violence of factions. Majority rule creates an opportunity for the majority to oppress the minority. The only way that we can maintain our system of government and enjoy a situation where majorities don't oppress their opponents is when we consistently affirm and reaffirm our commitment to certain realities and certain principles. The reason that Madison believed that popular government would work and could work is because he believed that basically there within all of us is a basic desire and respect for each other that must be there if a government like ours is even to exist. In fact, you recall the quotation from the Federalist paper where Madison makes the point that if a case can be made that the Constitution does not respect people's ability for good, people's inclination, the idea of conscience, what Jefferson referred to as the moral sense. Madison said, if a case can be made that our Constitution does not abide by that, does not incorporate that, but in effect is alien to it, then Madison said supporters of the Constitution have only one avenue, only one obligation, and that is to vote against the Constitution, not ratify it. Because as Madison said, that is the genius of the American people, is that faith. The only way that people can peacefully resolve their differences is when there are certain things that remain givens, that never make it on the table of debate or never enter the field of politics. In today's world, those common agreements, those things that we can and ought to be able to take for granted, are being overlooked, are being dismissed. In a civilized society, you can't have that and remain civilized. That kind of respect and trust in other people is the basis of what makes our political system work. And that means that those who grow up in this system and are educated into what it's about, how it works, why it works, and what we have to do to make sure it continues to work, have to be grounded in this, have to be able to accept the fact that there are certain givens that are not on the table, that are not matters of elections. Those norms, those acceptable issues which constitute the ingredients of a civilized society are being lost. And the evidence is some of the legislation that is being proposed, which would do absolute, unbelievable harm to millions of people. In the abstract, there are no conditions or circumstances which should justify those kinds of activities. There are none. And if one of our political parties takes it upon itself to deny that reality and to threaten the kinds of actions and the kinds of things that civilized societies never even entertain as possibilities, then it seems to me they bear responsibility for what happens. And in a society where people are extremely frustrated and see no hope, what happens is liable to be violence. That's why communication, constant communication, is absolutely vital. We can't have the situation that we have in Washington now, where members of Congress leave town and go home every weekend and never engage the other party socially in anything. It's important that these kinds of conversations that people have walking down the hallway, walking to the restroom, or walking into the Senate cafeteria, those are critical. And we have reached the point in our society where they don't happen. Increasingly, they happen less and less. Mitch McConnell, and I'm using this as an example of what I'm talking about. I'm not blaming it all on Mitch McConnell. Unfortunately, if it was that easy, we could fix it. On health care, Mitch McConnell made the statement that he's not even interested in involving the Democrats in developing the legislation on health care. 1/6 of the economy. Millions and millions and millions of Americans in danger of losing their health care. And the leader of one of our parties made it clear that he's not even interested in communicating with the other. And he's playing the rules of the Senate, the rules of the game, right down to the letter in order to amass the votes necessary to do incalculable damage to millions of Americans. It is not just a political decision, this passage of health care. It is a human decision. And it seems to me, if you choose to make it political, if violence occurs as a result, you bear some of that responsibility. There were a number of articles, as one would expect this weekend, related to the shootings in Alexandria last Friday morning. I've read several. I'd like to share with you two. One is from the Washington Post, the other is from the New York Times. The one in the New York Times was written by Frank Bruni, who's a regular columnist for the Times. This is dated June 17th, which is Sunday, yesterday. No, I believe it was Saturday. It's dated Saturday, but I believe it was printed Sunday. Let me share with you what Bruni says. The shooting that wounded the Republican Congressman Steve Scalise and 4 others may or may not be the bitter fruit of that. The biography of the gunman, James Hodgkinson, suggests many prompts, including mental illness. But, Bruni says, it demands soul-searching along those lines. If not physically, then civically, we're in a dangerous place when it comes to how we view, treat, and talk about people we disagree with. Ugly partisanship may not be new, but some of its expressions and accelerants are new. we'd be foolish to let this moment pass without owning up to them. Over the past decade, he says, in particular, the internet and social media have changed the game. They speed people to like-minded warriors and give them the impression of broader company or sturdier validation than really exist. The fervor of those in the anti-vaccine movement exemplifies this. So did the stamina of Americans who insisted that Barack Obama was born abroad and who were egged on by Donald Trump. David Simas, who was President Obama's political director, is quoted in a New Yorker article written by David Remnick right after the November elections. And this is what Simas said. What people find on the web, he says, creates a whole new permission structure, a sense of social affirmation for what was once unthinkable. An explanation, and this is Barack Obama himself. He says, an explanation of climate change from a Nobel-winning physicist looks exactly the same on Facebook as the denial of climate change by somebody on the Koch brothers' payroll, unquote. In other words, social media eliminates all the circumstances, all the perspective, all the context. All that remains is the word, are the words on the page. And thereby, if you look at that, there's no way to distinguish an informed opinion from an uninformed one. An opinion expressed by somebody who knows what's going on as compared to an opinion expressed by somebody who doesn't have a clue what's going on. On Facebook, they look the same. On Twitter, they especially look the same because they're limited to 140 characters. Obama says, the capacity to disseminate misinformation, wild conspiracy theories, to paint the opposition in wildly negative light without any rebuttal, that has accelerated in ways that much more sharply polarize the electorate, President Obama added. Suspicion becomes certainty. Certainty leads to fury, especially if you've got people that are on the edge anyway, especially in a society that is so heavily influenced by groups like the NRA, which make weapons so readily available to so many. Think about it. Think about what we're doing. Anyway, that's Bruni's article. I thought it was pretty insightful. The other one from the Washington Post was written on Friday by Michael Gerson. And he talks about those people who would use the violence that occurs for political reasons. And one of the people he associates with this is Rush Limbaugh, who made the statement on his radio program that the shooter in Alexandria, quote, was a mainstream Democrat voter, unquote. Gerson makes the point: the capacity for human evil is always there. But stable societies construct restraints against that evil. Some of those restraints are institutional, balancing interest against interest, power against power, as Madison does in the Constitution. In America, such institutions are strong, even under considerable strain that they're under now. Yet, and this is, I think, significant, human beings are also restrained by certain norms, unenforceable standards of civility and respect. We rely on character in countless ways to keep people from destroying themselves and destroying each other. Here, all the demonization, decapitation fantasies, all the talk of revolution and warfare against our fellow citizens have begun to take the toll. The norms which make us civilized are rapidly disappearing or fading into the background. Gerson says, and he is conservative, Gerson says that we can associate a lot of this with the era of Donald Trump. The one thing that he says we can know, all of us, even Trump supporters, is the regular routine violation of norms. Every violation or transgression seems to justify a response. The trashing of norms, he says, has not only normalized, but monetized. The president's violation of norms is a reason for criticism and opposition, but it is not justification for demonization. It's one thing to criticize him. It's another to demonize him. And the one thing we all see, and this is me talking, not Gerson, is the inclination or the tendency to dig in the heels and respond in kind.
Hey, Dr.
It's frightening.
Bill?
Yes, Bob.
I think you just hit the well, you just got to the heart of it, as you so often do.
Okay.
That line, the temptation to respond in kind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that presupposes that all the demonizing has already taken place.
Right.
The President of the United States is a demonizer. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, if I may be so bold, why does one not? Why should I guess I'm saying that I have little patience with the sort of twee preciousness of these conservatives who say, well, I'm a conservative, but I don't like Donald Trump, and I don't approve Donald Trump's methods, but now let's not be mean to Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Since when is sauce for the goose not sauce for the gander?
Yeah. Yeah.
He has spent his entire life sliming people.
Mm-hmm.
That is what we wound up with at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
That's right. We elected him. That's exactly right. And that's why there was so many people were so convinced that he could never win, because of that track record that he has.
But I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? I don't have any patience for the Gersons of the world saying, well, he's god awful, but we have to be better than that. No.
Yeah.
I'll be quite frank. I want the man's presidency to end before the country does, because that's what's at stake. The very continued existence of the United States of America.
Right.
This isn't a Nixon. This isn't Iran-Contra. In both of those instances, you had people that one might have disagreed with, who, in Nixon's case, were obviously engaged in ham-fisted, broad criminal conduct. But this man as I think Madison and Hamilton both imagined might happen someday, is utterly, completely, and totally unsuited to the duties of the office.
Right. And the word demonization, you use him as a demonizer. And what that means, Bob, and I think I do agree with you, what that means is that he is taking the debate or the political dialogue down to levels that it ought never to reach.
Oh, yeah, we've gone for a wallow. I mean, for God's, I mean, what standard would Gerson employ? What's okay and what's not? The man has set himself up now as the national arbiter of what theater we may see and not see.
That's right.
I was going to mention this tonight, but this is an appropriate time now. Since Julius Caesar is out, well, let's put it this way: there's a whole lot of Shakespeare's plays that have that deal with kings, monarchs, what have you, coming to an unpleasant end.
Unpleasant end, yes.
So if Shakespeare's out, I guess Donald wouldn't approve of anybody producing Richard III anymore, would they?
No. And I see
my kingdom for a plane.
I see where you're going.
I guess Richard II is out.
Yep.
All three parts of Henry VI are out. The Scottish play is definitely out.
And so what you're saying, Bob, I think, is that Shakespeare makes the point that there are certain kinds of behaviors that are never acceptable.
Yes.
Never. I agree with you.
And you know what? The hissy that these jumped up Manhattan hillbillies have engaged in betrays the depth of their ignorance. Mm-hmm. The message of Julius Caesar is not, hey, let's all go stab Caesar.
No.
The message of Julius Caesar is, don't kill Caesar.
No.
Bad things happen.
Right.
Throughout Shakespeare, and I was a bit of a Shakespeare aficionado in college. There is a running theme in all these stories.
Yeah.
Don't kill the king. Terrible things happen to your country when you kill the king, even if the king is awful.
Right.
Even if he's got it coming to him.
Well, the fact that's the point. I think is I think this issue having it coming to him. I think that what we refuse to accept in our conversation is that there are certain behaviors which under no circumstances are acceptable. No agenda can justify them.
Yeah, but you feel that, Bill, and I feel that. But guess what?
But the Gersons of the world do not.
Well, our political opponents do not. I'm sure by now you've seen the absolutely sleazy, slimy, filthy ad that's running in that a PAC is running in Georgia right now.
In Georgia, I did see it, Bob.
Yeah.
I was going to mention
the
that.
liberals are crazy. They're killing Republicans.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess only Republicans are allowed to kill because the list of Republicans who have killed other people is like 100 to 1.
Yeah.
All right. So, you know, this idea that somehow we've got. I mean, it would be great if we could rise above it all. But it reminds me of Madison saying that if men were angels, we would need no government.
Right. No, I that's what bothers me. And you know, when I say you agree and I agree, the fact of the matter is what I'm concerned about is I think that the president and the party and those people who are in the background like Mitch McConnell and the rest of them and will not take a stand on this are aiding and abetting behavior and situations which are violations of everything that this society is about. And it's going to precipitate violence. It can't do anything else except precipitate violence. And the point is, you use the expression that they deserve it. And of course, immediately a lot of people are going to say nobody deserves violence. Violence is never justified. But the fact of the matter is, if you take away every other option from people, that's the only option you leave. And we're going to get it unless we reestablish the basics that hold our society together.
Think about what Dr. King said about what a riot is. I don't have the quote directly to mind, but it's something like it is a riot is the cry of the voiceless.
Right.
There's more to it than that.
Right.
But
right.
Let's be clear about something. When Steve Scalise gets well, and I hope he does, mm-hmm. there's not going to be any great moment of change. He's not going to emerge from the hospital and say, I want to thank the American people, not for your prayers, not for your thoughts, but for paying with your hard-earned money so that I could have the best medical care available to save my life. He's not going to say that.
No.
And he's not going to say, and I want to make sure from this day forward that I support the ability of every American to have the kind of care that I got. He's not going to say that either. He's going to go back to being what he was and what he is.
No. Exactly.
And you know what? It's not. And here, just if I may, here's a further query for Mr. Gerson's plea for non-demonization. Is it demonizing Steve Scalise to point out facts? To point out facts about him? Now, it's one thing to say, call him a name or something. It's not what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
But is it demonizing to describe him as Klan sympathizer Steve Scalise?
Right.
Because he is, Bill.
I know he is.
Is that demonizing? Do we have to put that aside for another day?
So what you're doing is what you're raising here are the issues that make this extremely complex, much more than peoples are inclined to make it. And my feeling is that we are condoning behavior on the part of some people who should know better that can have no other result except violence. And because every avenue to anything other than violence is being denied.
What did JFK say? Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution
likely.
Inevitable.
Right.
And look, when you say that people are left with what I think we need, and I think Madison and Hamilton would agree with me. Mm-hmm. We need a better language, or a better way within the language, to describe political activities. Because taking health care away from tens of millions of American citizens is a form of violence.
It's violent, yes. It's killing people. It's going to kill people. And the basis on which it kills people is going to be determined by their lack of access to health care and the lack of resources to good health care. And that's the point. Those are the things that I was really struck by this. I can't remember who it was, this congressman who made the point that from his perspective, there ought not to be a debate on health care because everybody ought to believe that health care is a right, but everybody doesn't. That's That's the
No,
reality.
no. If you ask Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, Republican, is health care a right, his hair will catch fire.
Right.
And he will begin to fulminate and froth.
Right.
There is no such right.
No. It's something that people earn. And that's what Tom Cotton says. Is that what the reason there is a debate about health care is because I believe it's not about health care. It's about who deserves it and who doesn't. It's about not giving it to people that some people believe are not worthy of it.
So let's put this in perhaps starker terms. It's about who is as American as Steve Scalise.
That's the point. You got it.
If you can't have health care in this country, you're not as American as Steve Scalise.
Right.
On the same day he was shot, and I've been trying to, this is just stuck in my head, Bill.
San Francisco.
San Francisco.
Yeah.
The 3 people who died in San Francisco as a result of policies that Steve Scalise supports.
Right.
Each one of those paid some portion of their wealth to provide him the best health care money can buy.
Right.
Why didn't they have it?
Right. That's right. That's right. No, you got it, Bob. I really do agree there. This idea of Shakespeare, this theme for your program tonight, I think is fascinating because you're right that ultimately Shakespeare's tragedies are such that people reach the point where there's nothing else left but, and that's what we're talking about here. Is for a lot of people, they have reached the point where there's nothing left but violence. And so ultimately, we as a society are responsible for the violence that happens amongst us, for the violence that occurs. We're responsible. And, and you're right, Steve Scalise and those people that vote like him. And I don't care what their agenda, what their thinking is, or the way that they convince themselves that it's okay to support the elimination of health care for 23 million people. I just can't. There is no justification for that.
And sadly, Bill, our side will not have the gumption or perhaps nerve to frame it as it should be framed. The next time the health care issue comes up, look at the Republicans and say, okay, what you're saying is that there is a segment of America that should not have access to health care like Steve Scalise had.
Right.
Now that we understand each other, let's vote.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's right.
The Shakespeare thing, when I think of Trump, and I've done this, when I think of Trump in terms of Shakespeare, I don't think of Julius Caesar. I don't think of Richard III or Richard II. You know who I think of? I bet you do.
Falstaff.
King Lear.
Okay.
Lear, actually, because first of all, Lear is an old man. Mm-hmm. And he has an empire of sorts. And he's worried about how he's going to divvy it up. And he comes up with the worst possible solution. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, all comparisons end in that regard when you realize that Lear is at least self-aware. He's concerned with things outside Lear, his realm, the future. I don't know that we can necessarily say that about Donald Trump.
No, I don't think so. That's what I was just going to say. I don't think so.
Donald Trump's universe consists of Donald Trump.
Of Donald Trump, exactly. And the implication that his wife moving back into the White House was somehow going to have an impact on his behavior. I mean, talk about a stretch. My God. But Bob, I thank you. I'm really glad that you joined us, because I knew and I read posting you put on Facebook the other day about Scalise, and I knew you were all over this topic, and it was just, I was kind of hoping that you'd share it with us, and I thank you for it.
Always a pleasure, Dr. Bill. I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Okay, buddy. Thank you. I guess we might as well. We got about 2 minutes left, so I guess we better wind it up. Actually, we do have 2 minutes left. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I want to especially thank Bob for his contribution. I think we're really onto something here, something very, very important, and I'm sure it'll come up. It'll come up tomorrow as well. I hope that everybody has a wonderful evening. Please be kind to each other. Treat each other the way you hope they will treat you. And if everything goes well, we'll be back together again tomorrow. Keep in mind that our program begins 30 minutes later tomorrow than today. So in Eastern Daylight Time, that'll be 1:30 to 3 tomorrow afternoon. For Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On, this is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center saying thank you very, very much for the opportunity to share some of these thoughts with you. Thank you.